It's the 24th of August, 1744, at 10 a.m. in the morning. And the context is St. Mary's Church, Oxford. And it was here that John Wesley preached his sermon that is now known as sermon number 4 in the collected sermons, the standard sermons. And what a momentous occasion it was. You have to imagine the large solemn procession that took place when Mr Wesley came in to preach on this particular day. There was the rector of the university, there were all the dignitaries and so on and so forth that were making a great procession. What happened was this. Wesley was a fellow of his college, and the fellows were expected to preach on a rostered basis. Maybe it would occur once every 2 or 3 years. And of course, by 1744, John Wesley had made quite an enormous reputation for himself as an open-air preacher, and many Church of England pulpits had been closed to him by then. But he had to fulfil the duties of his fellowship, and that was the only one. Now, it was in the terms of the fellowship that if a fellow couldn't preach, they would appoint someone else to do so on the occasion. They would pay someone else to stand in for them. But John was determined that he was going to fulfill his fellowship obligations. And he'd already preached 2 times that Sunday morning before he came to St. Mary's. So it was a very splendid occasion, and he was in full canonicals. His clerical garb and university garb to the maximum. And he preached this sermon, Scriptural Christianity, the first 3 parts of which are actually quite a reasonable explanation in his own terms of how the Bible, how the Christian faith had grown and developed and spread throughout the world. But then in the 4th part of the sermon, which he never intended, by the way, to publish, in the 4th part of the sermon, he actually said of all the people in the congregation, the students, the dons, all the dignitaries, he said of them that he didn't believe that Oxford was a Christian city. He believed that the students were a generation of triflers. He didn't think that the lectures that were ever provided at the university were up to much. Well, to some extent, you may recall that we learned Isaac Newton would often lecture to an empty lecture hall. The lectures he provided were too difficult for most, if not all, the undergraduates that ought to have been going to listen. Maybe it was something in the way he presented. Certainly not a presentation issue in Wesley's case. St. Mary's was packed. He called the students a generation of triflers. He declared that Oxford was a godless place. He had impugned the scholastic rigour of the university. And when the worship came to an end, no one, apart from Charles and 2 others, would walk in the procession with John Wesley out. Now, the Chancellor of the university called for Wesley's notes on the sermon because it was clear that he had offended the vast bulk of people who were at that service. It must have been a wonderful occasion, all full of the pomp and ceremony that you find associated with Anglicanism. And here's this person who has attacked it. So Wesley provided the Chancellor with his full set of notes. He fully expected to be dismissed from the post. And what happened was this. The councils of the university that administered the fellowships decided that it would treat Wesley with contempt by never inviting him to preach again. They did not take away his fellowship, but what they chose to do was that they said they would pay a visiting preacher to come and preach when it was Wesley's turn. And so effectively they were saying to John Wesley, this pulpit also is denied you, and effectively your fellowship means nothing. Well, Wesley lived with us, and a few years later he voluntarily resigned his fellowship. I think it was about 9 years on. I could be mistaken in that. But what an incredible thing to have occurred. And it seems to me that in some ways this marks the heart of what it is to be a Methodist preacher. You meticulously prepare and you practice what you're going to say. Wesley would often be preaching the same material over and over about the general spread of Christianity. And then you have your bullets that you want to fire. They're theological bullets, they're social bullets, they're bullets of compassion, they're bullets of conscience. And when Wesley said that he found the vast majority of students to be triflers, I think to a large extent he was correct. Many other records from that day and age will attest to the fact that students did not take their studies particularly seriously. That didn't mean, though, that Wesley ought to have attacked everyone. There was absolutely splendid scholarship going on within the different Oxford colleges. Now, there's Wesley's own account of this occasion in his journals, but there's also an account by Charles in his journal, and there were two very interesting observations. One was from a young man who would go on to become a very famous Hebrew scholar in his own right, and he made the comment publicly that the first 3 quarters of Wesley's sermons was absolutely brilliant in his opinion. It just laid out the territory as one might have expected. And he wished that Wesley had been far more temperate, far more cautious in the delivery of the last part of the sermon. There was also another young scholar who went on to be a very famous judge. And he made very, very clear in a long letter that he thought that Wesley had clearly overstepped any kind of decent boundary. So, and interesting enough, in the latter case, Wesley made reference back to this judge later on, many, many decades later on, about what a fine judge he was. So Wesley didn't hold it against him that he had been judged against for his sermon. But when we ask why this attack, it's puzzled Wesley scholars for a very long time, but I put it down to conscience. Wesley himself was a polymath. He was a scholar who went in every direction. As we know, he had a prodigious written output. And I think he looked at his colleagues and he looked at students. He and Charles had been students in that college, and in Oxford rather, and very few could compare to their enthusiasm, their fervour. And this is sometimes where evangelism can get ahead of itself. And I think that's what happened in Wesley's case. But I would want to argue that it is, even in its most stinging rebukes, nevertheless, a very, very fine sermon and set of insights. So I commend sermon number 4, Scriptural Christianity, to you. It's worthy of study.